People are opinionated, aren't they? I mean, not me. I'm not opinionated. I am. For example, I'm sure many of us have heard of the movie Avatar. For those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with it, Avatar is one of the highest grossing films of all time. It was absolutely groundbreaking in the CGI that was used in it, and people get really emotional over the plot. And I just think it's a terrible movie. I can't stand it. And so because of that opinion, I'm very passionate about it. And so I have been known to get in debates with people over whether Avatar is a good movie or not. And we both hold our ground, and because we're passionate about our opinion. But it's very difficult to leave your opinions at the door when you enter the church building, isn't it? With that thought in mind, I would like to read from Galatians chapter 5. I'd like to read starting in verse 13. For you were called to freedom, brethren. Only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, in the statement, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. Here, Paul is talking with the Galatians about how they shouldn't turn back to the things of the old law. He talks about that a few verses earlier. Because only through faith by God's grace can we be justified and forgiven of our sins. The law could never accomplish that fully. And last week, Danny talked about how in verses 13 and 14, we need to love one another and serve one another. But then verse 15 offers something that almost appears to be a contrast to loving and serving. When he says, if you bite and devour one another, take care that you are not consumed by one another. So it almost gives the idea that the opposite of serving or loving one another is consuming one another. Well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Verse 13 kind of gives us a little bit of an image when it talks about how we shouldn't use the freedom which we receive from Christ as an opportunity to fulfill fleshful desires. I think I think the first one that will come to mind is just sin in general. Sin which comes from our corrupted desires of the flesh brings about strife and disunity. Such things have been known to tear apart not only relationships but tear apart entire churches. And these things need to be avoided. That's part of what Paul's warning. That by that we can become consumed by one another in that disunity that sin brings. But are there other ways that perhaps we can bite and devour one another? I think there are. This is where it gets a little bit uncomfortable for us because it involves our opinions. Opinions, not really rooted in sinful things, but at the same time, not rooted in any solid biblical foundation. It's just things that we think are good. Like circumcision earlier in this chapter, which Paul says it's of no spiritual value to Christians anymore. And a few examples, I think. Sometimes people are like, they're very particular about what style haircut people should have. Guys should only have short hair, and girls should have long hair, and there should be no crossover on that. Or perhaps homeschool versus public school. Some churches really have like debates over that, or strife among the members because of that. Because there's disagreements on whether you should send your kids to a public school or a private school, or keep them at home and homeschool them. Or the ever cynical repeating cycle of politics and who you should vote for. Now, understand, intention is very important in all these things. If I change my hairstyle because I want to live a sinful lifestyle, then that's sin. But it's not because I change my hairstyle, it's because of the lifestyle I am choosing that goes against God's will. If I vote for a certain political figure on any side of the political spectrum because of their sinful things which they uphold proudly, then I think there is something wrong with that mindset. But if I'm just voting for them because I agree with their political views, their views of government, then we argue about that. That just divides the church. Satan simply uses that to tear us apart. We use the freedom which we have received from Christ, which is intended for us to be able to give to each other and to produce for one another. But we use that instead to take and consume, and in that we are consumed. So then how do we prevent this cycle of devouring one another and being consumed by one another? I think verse 16 and 17 offer the solution. But I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not carry out the desire of the flesh. For the flesh sets its desire against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, so that you may not do the things that you please. The flesh wants to fulfill its desires, but as people freed by Christ, that should not be our focus. We ought not concern ourselves with the things of the flesh. Rather, we are to walk by the Spirit and use our freedom, which we have, not as an opportunity to divide ourselves further on things that are of the flesh. Rather, we are to work together on being more unified in the Spirit and in the things of the Spirit, the Word, and the church.